Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, CEO and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group. And I'm back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. This is the show where we break down the big and most relevant HR issues of the day. We have a good one today. We help you make sense of what they mean, and we talk about what you might do about them. So joining me today is Ruth Thomas, Chief Product Evangelist at Payscale and an expert in compensation and pay equity. She spends a lot of time with customers listening and hearing what the issues are. So we're going to hear some of that today. Some of you may know I grew up in compensation, and I met Ruth a number of years ago working in this area, and we've been friends ever since. Welcome, Ruth. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Teri. And it's great to have finally got to appear on your podcast on the HR Huddle.
Yeah, I'm excited. We've got a great topic today. So you and I talk a lot about pay equity and other comp issues. Not for our topic today, but I'm sure you saw the payout to Coco Gauff this weekend for winning the US Open. I loved that she did that shout out to Billie Jean King. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's another great moment in women's sport. I think after the women's soccer down under in Australia and the football soccer, depending on which side of the pond you sit on. Yeah, another great moment in women's sport. So
yeah, that was pretty cool. So I recently read Payscale's report on employee retention and was intrigued by some of the findings as it relates to retention. And I also got a bit of a sneak peek of the state of remote work that you guys are working on. So those are some things I want to talk about today. Does that sound like a good plan to you?
yeah, sounds great. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about those two reports.
Awesome. Then let's get into the huddle. So I've read varying opinions on retention of late, especially in light of sort of on again, off again, looming recession, lots of layoffs, even though unemployment is still low. Interest rates are high. Many of these things obviously impact employees' motivation to look for a new job, but it still seems to be a pretty competitive labor market out there. So this report you guys did on retention, I mean, this is pretty timely, right?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the year, we called out, amongst many other commentators in the market, that maybe 2023 would be the year of retention. And that was, at the time, if you think about it, coming off that wave of the Great Resignation, and a lot of employers were experiencing turnover and losing employees in that phase. Obviously, then we suddenly pivoted into seeing certain sectors laying off staff. We saw headcount freezes, and a lot of people sitting on the fence because they didn't really know which way generally the labor market was going to go. And you called it, Teri, it's still a very tight labor market. We know that many employers in different sectors are experiencing skill shortages. So you'd be foolish not to think that retention isn't something that you should be worried about. And that's really why our report was timely, because I think as employers look into pay review season, which we're just starting now and will run for the next 3 to 4 months, and employers start thinking about where they will invest in their people in the next sort of 6 months, thinking about retention and the things that cause people to leave your organization is really important.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. What did the report cover, and what were some of the interesting call outs?
Well, we looked at 5 key job sentiment characteristics, and we examined how they correlated with whether people intended to seek a new job. So we do this research on our online salary survey data. So we collect profiles from employees. They come to Payscale. They're looking for work. They enter their salary details into our online salary survey. And we looked at 600,000 profiles from the period of March 2018 to March this year. And it was mainly for US workers, this survey studied. And we looked at things like, does the company have a bright future? Does the company pay fairly? Does the company have a great culture? What is your relationship like with your manager? and pay transparency, another hot topic. And we correlated that with how they felt about those and whether they would stay or leave the organization. So it was really some fascinating insights that we picked up.
Where did things like recognition or advancement, mobility, things like that, where did they fit into that list?
So they weren't data points that we specifically collected, but probably advancement, you could potentially say, came under company bright future.
Yeah.
So people like, do I feel like I have the opportunity to advance and progress with this company? Yeah. So we looked at those 5 very specific data points only in the context of this study. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't say I was completely surprised by the big areas, but what I was surprised by was the size of the impact some of those things had, and particularly the bright future and the impact of pay transparency. Can you talk about those two just a little bit more and what some of the things are that you kind of drew out of that information?
Yeah, so we did 2 sets of analysis. We did one where we just looked at the impact of pay transparency on its own. And then we also looked at one analysis where we correlated all 5 of those job sentiment characteristics. So when we looked at pay transparency on its own, because it's something obviously we've been following a lot here at Payscale, and it's something that we can help our customers with, we saw very much a very high correlation between the more transparent you are in an organization, the less likely your employees are to leave your organization. That didn't surprise us. We asked people to rate was their organization transparent on a scale of 1 to 5. And for each of those scales, we saw a 30% drop off. So that's quite a big drop off step by step. So if you're a highly transparent organization, then by the time you get to be a low transparent organization, you're seeing a continual drop off step by step of 30%. But it didn't surprise us because we have historically done other research on fair pay and the importance of fair pay on whether people want to stay with an organization. And that correlated with the data that we'd seen in that. And that really shows historically that it's not how much someone's paid in an organization, it's how they feel about their pay is a stronger sentiment about whether they'll stay with you as an employer or not.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out the interplay between the fair play perception and pay transparency, because obviously fair pay perception had a pretty high percentage decrease in people's leaving, whereas the pay transparency had a lower value there, but they're really interconnected.
Yeah. So if you want to see all the stats on this, it's available on payscale.com. If you go to research and reports, you can find online. It's free and online. So those listeners, if they want to see those stats. But yeah, when we correlated all 5 of those characteristics together, bright future had the biggest impact. So that was overall minus 39%. So that was like a person's intent to leave the organization. Fair pay perception came in at 27%, company culture at 22%, manager relationship at 21%, and pay transparency was down at 1% when we looked at against all those other factors. I think my take on that was pay transparency is still quite new. People are still getting used to this concept of what does pay transparency mean for me and my organization. And if you think we did collect that data back to March 2018, and we've really only seen the push for that pay transparency legislation happen really in the last 24 months. So that may have impacted the data to some degree. But bright future, if you think in the context of where we are this year, where probably there are many employees who are concerned about, is their employer going to survive the markets that we're in at the moment, then it's maybe not surprising to see that's the biggest concern of employees in terms of whether they'll stay with you or not.
Yeah. And I think not all organizations do a great job they market to their customers, but there's a lot of sort of internal marketing, if you will, that needs to happen that just really doesn't happen a lot of times.
Yeah. So really thinking about how you communicate the health of your business to your internal talent. It's interesting because in my role when I was a practitioner in compensation, this was really the time of year we crafted those messages because we would be going out to managers with the compensation budgets. And we needed to steer managers on what the story was in the business for that year, because that told the story around whether we had lots of money to spend on base pay and bonuses that year, or whether we had no money to spend on bonuses that year. And so this was always very much a time of year as a COP practitioner, we were thinking about those messages. And I think for anyone going into that period now, have a long think about what is the story you want to tell to your internal population about how your business has fared this year and what the outlook looks for next year.
Yeah, because
and hopefully you've got a positive spin on that as well. So.
Yeah, hopefully. I also just read an article that said compensation increases this year were at their highest in a number of years. And yet I've been working with a few different organizations who are not nearly that high in their statistics this year. So it's curious. And that to me sends a message to the employees that, hey, I'm seeing where compensation increases or merit increases are pretty high this year. What happened here?
Yeah, it's hard. I think post-COVID, trying to look for one magic number of what the pay markets are moving at is not a thing anymore. If you look back pre-COVID and you think about the 10 years before pre-COVID, pretty much if you were to say, oh, it's going to be 3% next year, you'd be close to being right, irrespective of whether you're looking in the US or whether you're looking in Europe. That changed significantly because of the impact the pandemic had on different sectors. And we know the story of how that played out. Some sectors fared well and some sectors not so bad. And then what's happened to talent supply in those sectors post-COVID. So I always say now, you've got to work a lot harder. If you're working in compensation, you can't just go looking for that one magic overall number now. So if you're seeing those headlines, we've just published our salary budget survey. I think the overall number, I don't want to misquote it, but it was near the 4% we are saying budgeted salary increases going into 2024. And that varied by location. But, that was very sector specific. So we also break those numbers down by sector, and we can see there were some sectors that were definitely not near the 4% mark. And then there were others that were at 4.5, getting to like high 4%. So I think we just got to work a little harder in terms of looking at our own talent markets for our own businesses when we think about what's the right pay for that.
Yeah. Well, so let's switch gears a little bit to an area that gets a lot of press. And I know you have something coming out on this topic within days, or it may be out by the time we post this conversation, remote work. So while this isn't on your list in the retention report, I think we all know it's having an impact on employees' decisions about what their preference is and who they're going to work for, depending on whether those preferences can be met. What are you seeing in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, this transition to remote work or return to office mandates, it's another strong headline story we're seeing in HR. For us, it's important at Payscale because one, it impacts employee engagement, but it also impacts pay. And we support employers in terms of coming up with location pay strategies. So we're interested to see which way people are going in terms of adapting to the different work models that we now have. But I was really excited about this report. And as you say, it will be very hot off the press by the time potentially this podcast goes live. We did a survey of employers between July and August this year. So it's fresh data. And we asked them a number of questions. And we really wanted to dig underneath the headlines that we've seen about bosses wanting people back in the office because of a decline in productivity. And we wanted to really investigate whether we thought that was real or not. And we saw some interesting results in the study.
Yeah, that definitely, to me, was interesting. And it's certainly what I've been hearing a lot of people, that's definitely been in the headlines, right? So there's this sort of decline in productivity. And this is all about working remotely or working from home. But so did the survey bear any of that out?
No, it didn't, which was interesting. So we asked a number of questions in relation to this, and it's probably worth breaking some of those down. So we asked if executive leadership believed that productivity in their organization has or would decrease due to remote work, because that's the headlines we're seeing, the bosses of the big organizations that are hitting the headlines. And we saw only a minority of organizations, 24%, answered in affirmative. So less than a quarter of bosses think that remote work is causing a decline in productivity. I also find it interesting when we hear these declarations that our productivity is dropping off, I often wonder, are organizations actually monitoring that? And so that was another specific question that we asked, is we said, are you measuring increase? Are you monitoring productivity? Do you have mechanisms in place to monitor productivity within your organization? And we saw that only 50-70% of organizations said they measured productivity. So that's quite a high number. Nearly 60% said they measure it, but only 10% said they do so tangibly. So the question is, do organizations really have a handle on whether remote work is impacting their productivity or not? And I think there are lots of other things. I mean, you and I can probably go on and talk a lot about what are the different things we think are impacting in productivity. So we didn't see the evidence behind return to work needed because we think it will improve employee productivity. That was not the reason we saw in the study.
Yeah. And I also, one of the things that you hear a lot is that managers don't trust that their employees are doing work when they're not visible. But I just read an article, I think it was in HRE, that said that's not really a factor. It's like 3%, which is pretty low. I'm sure there are some managers out there who need that sort of visibility, but for the most part, you're on calls with people all day, you're interacting, you're not completely invisible to the organization.
Yeah, we saw that same trend in our data. I don't have to hand the exact percentage. I think it really comes down to how effectively you're managing your people. Because whether you're in an office or out of an office, you as a manager should know whether the people that you're directly supervising are meeting their goals and objectives. Are they being productive? Are they doing the things that you want them to do to help drive the business forward? If you know that, whether they're remote or in the office, probably doesn't make any difference. And I think what actually happens is that maybe managers don't have the full grasp on that, and maybe they need to think about their practices there in order to really monitor productivity and get that trust around whether their employees are being as productive as they can.
Yeah. Did you break this down at all by, or do you plan to? I'm sure you have the data with as many data points as you have, sort of by industry or by generation. Like a lot of people really look at their workforce by generation. And you hear a lot about the Gen Zs, but they do operate differently. And I think they do have a different approach to work. I was curious if you saw anything in either this survey or in other data that you have over the last year.
So I can't remember off the top of my head whether we've got anything on Gen Z in the remote work study. I know that from the observations that I've seen and from what I've read kind of generally in the press, that the Gen Z population have higher expectations around workplace flexibility. And they very much don't believe in the whole concept of the kind of the corporate temple. And that's a place where we all have to go to gather. And they very much are used to obviously using technology to live their everyday lives and network through technology. So for them, the whole remote work experience is closer to how they live their real lives. So that would be my kind of view there in terms of, I think we'd see, if we did break down the data from a generational perspective, stronger desire from Gen Z employees to not be forced to go back into the office. But there are other demographic groups, of course, we see for women or those with caring responsibilities. We know that they have strong preferences in terms of the workplace flexibility it gives them by working remotely or working in a hybrid situation. So we know that this is an important benefit for certain groups of the employee population as well.
Yeah. One of the things I found interesting in the sneak peek that I got was that they're not really even asking people about their preferences. Mm-hmm. So there's a pretty small group of organizations that bothered to ask. So I guess they don't want to know, or if they don't know, it won't hurt them kind of mentality, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because we did ask this question. We do another big annual study called the Compensation Best Practice Report. And this was a question we asked in that study that's published in January. So we're about to go into data collection period for that. And it was quite high then. It was quite a large number of employees who were asking employees on their return to work preferences. But when we asked in this particular study, only 22% said that they had surveyed their employees on their preferences, and they had done so recently, which does seem quite low. It's just like, really, if you're going to engage your workforce, you need to ask them about this, something as important as remote work. How does it impact you? What would your preferences be before you start deciding your strategies?
Yeah. Yeah. This is just an aside question, but do you think lack of engagement or the way that organizations have been engaging employees has dropped off in the last year or two? I mean, post COVID, there was so much like over engagement because people had gone remote and they were really trying to connect with people. But has some of that kind of waned and sort of put people on their back foot?
It was interesting. I was reading a few headlines last week on another great trend. It was the great gloom. I think it was based off a survey on employee happiness done by Bamboo HR. And they had looked at how much employee engagement had dropped off in 23 compared to prior years. And they had seen a 10% increase in the drop off of employee engagement this year from January compared to prior years. And a lot of it, one of the main reasons they saw in their research were these return to work mandates. So this is what's really disengaging employees. They don't want to be told that they've got to come back to the office. And I understand we did go into some detail in terms of asking why did you go remote, or why do you want people to come back to the office? And in the main, we saw the reasons why people were going remote was because they wanted to broaden their talent pools. And then when we look at people of why they wanted people to come back to the office, productivity was only the fourth highest scoring factor there. And actually building and maintaining culture and fostering collaboration were two stronger reasons why they wanted to get people back into the office. And I think if your culture is based on the four walls of your office, I think you've probably got a bigger problem with your culture. That would be my view. Yeah.
And obviously, if you incentivize people to come back to work versus mandate it, you're going to have a better result, right?
Yes. Yeah. Although there's been some interesting examples that have been kind of case studies in the press around interesting incentivization techniques where some people are potentially, I think that it was one example where someone was saying, we'll do a charity donation if you come back to the office. And it was like, well, what are you going to do if I don't come back to the office? It was slightly coercive. It felt a bit coercive in terms of that tactic, like we're trying to control you by coming back to the office.
Yeah. I mean, people get it. They've got a job to do. But at the same time, once you give a level of flexibility, it's kind of hard to take that back, right? It's like once you give somebody a salary increase, don't take it back.
Yep, I think really you're right. The gloves are off. We saw the great home working experiment during the pandemic. And if you actually look, I find it even interesting just looking at the figures now. So in our study, we saw that 40% of employers are split by job in terms of whether they're remote or in office. Only 11% of all the people we surveyed are in a traditional all employees in the office environment. And then 32% were hybrid and 18% were either remote first or fully remote. So being in the office is not the status quo anymore. Definitely there are more employers who are operating in a remote or a hybrid type of environment.
Yeah. So we're a really small company and we've always been remote. We've never had a real office where we go. But I was really excited to see that you guys went fully remote this year. So what drove that, and why are organizations sort of embracing this remote first or fully remote work?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us have been remote since the pandemic in 2020, even though we had business centers in the US. We had Seattle, Boston, and Denver. And then we also had offices in Ottawa, Edinburgh, and in Scotland and London in the UK, where I'm based. But I think it was really, we're a tech company, essentially. And you've seen that trend within the tech sector where it is much easier for businesses to operate in a remote fashion. And we decided that we would embrace that this year in 2023. And we made it a fundamental goal of our business strategy this year was that we were going to be really good at remote work. And we've focused a lot of resources on becoming a remote first leader. We've spent a lot of time cultivating cross-functional collaboration, creating meaningful in-person events, and trying to find unique ways or great ways for employees to be able to collaborate cross-functionally. We're still on a learning journey. We have just done an engagement survey. Actually, it's quite interesting. We've just seen the results of our annual engagement survey. And what did come out through that is the things that we have done well this year are all the things to do with remote work. So employees really value the benefit of remote work. Employees feel Payscale has given them the resources to make sure that they're set up effectively for remote work. And they feel that they've been able to structure their day around their work-life balance. So it was encouraging to see those things come out very strongly in our engagement survey this year.
That's great. What were some of the challenges that you ran into in kind of moving to this fully remote?
I think for some of our more junior individual contributors, for them, it's getting the mentoring experience. So how do you recreate that when you were in an office and someone said, come and join this meeting and just listen to what's going on? It's much harder to create that environment now. So that is something that we're kind of trying to teach managers. You have to manage in a completely different way in a remote environment. And you have to really think about creating those moments, or how you can create those moments through the way that we do through Zoom. But we also all have access to serviced offices, so we can go to any office anywhere we want to in the world, and we can bring groups together. So I know that there are lots of groups who do take that opportunity to come together to create those learning moments where groups may potentially need to spend some time together to benefit all members of the team.
Yeah. So do you still have some offices, or you literally shut down the offices, but now you use kind of these remote
co-working spaces? Yeah. So we got rid of all of our offices. So we have no office anymore. And we're 800 employees, I think we are. And we're free to work entirely from our own homes or in company-funded co-working spaces. And that's your choice as an employee. And we know that there are lots of teams who are coming together in order to sort of create those moments of collaboration and the moments of learning together.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting topic. Maybe we ought to do a session just on this conversation alone, because I'd love to hear more about, well, how long did it take you guys to affect this decision?
I think it was probably only about 3 to 4 months. I think it was. What we saw was that although we kept the offices in those major centers, people weren't coming back to the offices. Yeah. And so then the question was, well, why are we keeping these offices? And they were obviously split. There were some employees where coming into the office suited their work lifestyle choices. Mm-hmm. And so there were always going to be some people that felt they potentially lost out by way of the decision that was made. But I think what we have done is made an effort to make sure that we support employees in creating the space where they can work in their own homes. And that was very much kind of like we've helped employees to do that. We've helped them to think about what is the right place that you should be in the home, what is the right setup that you should have, and how do you kind of manage your day. So we've given a lot of guidance to employees around that.
Yeah, because I would say it's been pretty easy for us because we started that way. But I can't imagine being a company of more than a few hundred employees and literally just making that decision. So that's fascinating to me. And I'm anxious to hear as time goes on, like what some of the other challenges that you've run into. Is there any guidance or advice you'd give the audience if they're looking to do something similar, some things they might watch out for?
Well, definitely survey your employees. So listen to your employees, listen to their concerns. So maybe when they express the concerns of, I'm worried I don't have the space in my home where I can work and not be distracted. Maybe I don't feel that I will feel lonely in the home. If you listen to their concerns and then you set up the processes to support those concerns, then you're going to be in a much better place to kind of make a success of this, I think. And that's something that we did do well here at Payscale.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I did have another question about, I know one of the things that you guys do a lot of work on is helping organizations understand pay as it relates to the markets that people are in. And obviously with this remote work, that's changing the way people compensate, because in the past they typically compensated you based on the headquarters, right? If the headquarters was in San Francisco, you were going to get a whole lot more than if you were working in their office in Lincoln, Nebraska, for example. So I know geographic differentials is, I won't say it's making a comeback. It's always been there, but they seem like they're getting used a whole lot more today, obviously, as a result of people working remotely. Is that one of the biggest ways you see organizations dealing with the workplace location?
Yeah, I mean, we've been waiting to see if a clear trend would emerge this year in how people are going to manage these new work structures. So you've got potentially people who are in the office, you've got people who have moved from high cost areas to low cost areas to work remotely. You may have 100% remote workforce, and then you may have some employees who are hybrid. We're not seeing a one trend yet. So we still saw in our study, I mean, you mentioned the basing pay on where we are headquartered, still in this particular study came out as the strongest pay strategy in terms of defining location-based pay and, how you pay people. There's been a lot of talk about, will we see this trend towards everybody using a national median? And I think if there are lots of different survey providers. If you're looking at their data, what they have seen is a slow coming together of some of the high cost areas to some of the other kind of pay bands that we traditionally would have seen. And that has been driven by those employees moving from high cost areas back to more potentially median or low cost areas and not having their pay adjusted. So we've seen pay come up in those other zones to closer to the high cost areas. And so you could say potentially over time, we will see a trend towards a national median, and then we won't have to worry about location pay. But I still think we will see some kind of location-based pay strategy going on. And so when employers are doing that, they're either looking at market pricing. So they're going to a survey provider like ourselves, and they're saying, okay, how much does it cost to hire a solution engineer in Nebraska, and they're going to a pay service that provides that. Some surveys obviously don't have all that data, and so they use this thing called geo differentials, which it gives you a percentage adjustment based on the relativity of that location that you're looking up to the national median, and you can apply that. So that helps, because not all surveys have all jobs in all locations. And so using a geo differential can help you to try and work out what the pay should be in a particular location when you don't necessarily have the data.
Yeah. And I think that's an area that people have really had to begin to learn to understand how to use those geographic differentials, because a lot of organizations really didn't have a play for using them because they were using their headquarters location, and now everybody's working remotely.
Yeah. But I think it's still very mixed practice out there. So you've got people who've been protected on their salaries. You've got people who are paying the national median, but potentially they are still keeping their high cost zones, their high cost center zones. So unfortunately, I'd like to be able to say this is the way that you should do it, but we're not seeing a clear practice emerge at this point. I think it will take a while longer, probably another couple of years, before we see a kind of clear strategy emerge.
Yeah. The other interesting thing you see there, though, is people want to be mobile. So when this first started occurring early on in the process, I was working with a couple of high-tech firms, and they had people, they basically said, okay, everybody can work remotely wherever you want to work. Well, that opened up a Pandora's box of, well, I'm going to move to Germany for a few years and work from there. Is that okay? And that obviously created some real challenges for organizations to figure that out. Like, how are we going to do this if they're in Germany? And what does that mean? And how would we support that? And again, I mean, I think some of those mobile employees still want to move around every couple of years.
We addressed that here at Payscale because we put a full remote work policy in place, and you have the option of moving around if you want to go and do a month in LA and you want to go and do it. But we have a number of locations where you can't work because just from a legal tax perspective, it's just impossible for us to allow employees to work there. But you go through a process where you can just apply to say you want to go and be based somewhere else for a period of time, and then you can have that approved. And there's, as I said, there's a list of places that we can't facilitate, but in the main we can. And so we've kind of put that process in place to make sure that happens. And from a Payscale perspective, we're doing the right thing from kind of all our legal and tax obligations.
Yeah, I think that's, if I was going to tell somebody where to start, that would be make sure you understand the legal implications and the tax implications of that kind of a change. That'll be the first thing to bite you. Mm. So I know we've been talking about retention and then remote work. We talked a little bit about some advice to the audience for improving some of these things. Retention in particular, I think, get out there, do some pulse surveys, understand of those 5 topics. What are the areas that are most significant in your business? Like, where are you really struggling? Is it that people don't understand the future of your business? Or is it that they don't think their pay is fair? Or is your culture, just, do you need a culture overhaul? So I think those are some things people could do right out of the gate is, get the pulse of the people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And as I said, if you want to access those, what were those job sentiment characteristics that we surveyed, if you want that to be your starting point, you can access that research on payscale.com. There's also a white paper you can download, which has some of the strategies that you can start thinking about to tackle each of those 5 very different kind of challenges, workplace challenges.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ruth, for coming on today. This has been a great conversation. I've already told people where they can go. I'm sure they can find you on LinkedIn if they want to follow you and hear more about the day-to-day. And I would look for this other report to either come out, or it may already be out. So you may find the retention report as well as the remote work report.
Yeah.
Available by the time you hear this podcast. So thank you so much. Thanks to our producers, Brand Method Media Group. They do a great job of getting this out the door so that you guys can hear it. Our marketing team. And thank you for tuning in. That's all the time we have for today's episode of HR We Have a Problem. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to it on your favorite podcast. And if you don't mind, leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any topics you want us to talk about, love to hear that as well. You can also drop us a line or schedule a chat on the website. And we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ruth.